Wow, what a great crowd. And good evening, everyone. My name is Charlie Vogelheim, a former board member of the Mill Valley Historic Society, born and raised in this town, so an alleged millbilly, and proud of it. Thanks for all of you for being here tonight. This is the first Wednesday talk. Every first Wednesday of the month, the Mill Valley Historic Society produces a great series of speakers, and we're so thankful that you all joined us here tonight. And it couldn't be done also without the great cooperation we have here with this wonderful library we have here in Mill Valley. So quick round of applause for the library and the Mill Valley Historic Society. So to get right to it, as you all know, we're all blessed to live in this beautiful, beautiful place. You know, 2/3 of Marin County is undeveloped land. And this is the story of Marin's first successful conservationist, and that would be William Kent, you know his middle name, and his family. By 1901, William Kent had fallen in love with the trees of Marin's Redwood Canyon, and in 2005, he and his wife, Elizabeth, bought the 600-acre canyon to save the trees from a water company that was about to cut them down. It's the first act of conservation in Marin, and it found ways to preserve the wilderness in and around Mount Tamalpais, and then inspire us to create the National Park Service. Representing in this corner the National Park Service is Mia Monroe. She is with the Golden Gate National Park. Community liaison to Marin and works closely with One Tam, has spent most of her career, in and around Muir Woods National Monument, appreciating the lasting legacy of Elizabeth and William Kent, John Muir, and the many others who stewarded the mountain. Fred Runner, in the other corner, there you go. Wow. I heard a ooh. Has been the historian at the West Point Inn and the Mount Tamalpais Muir Road and the Mount Tamalpais Muir Woods Railway for over 2 decades. He's the author of Mount Tamalpais Scenic Railway, a guide to hiking the old railroad grade. Today he's the president of Friends of Number 9, which I know he'll talk about, the nonprofit that's helping restore the train. But that's not why he's here. We have these people, Muir Woods, West Point, but we're really here to talk about the Kent and the development. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here. Please welcome them.
Thank you very much. I'm Fred Runner. This is Mia Monroe. We're really glad to be here tonight. We last did this program in 2017 up at the West Point Inn. We were lucky enough to have William Kent's granddaughter, Nancy Kent Danielson, join us for dinner up there. The evening was actually the same thing on 2 nights. The kitchen cranked out a lovely meal. Then we sat around and talked about William Kent and the creation of Muir Woods, Mount Tamalpais, and then the National Park System, which is kind of an interesting part of all this. Anyway, when we were done with it, Nancy stood up and shook our hands, and that felt like a really wonderful appreciation of our stories about William Kent. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Mia because has a few things to say before we get going.
Thank you very much for this invitation. And I've worked for decades among the redwoods at Muir Woods, which is a very, very humbling experience. And for years, I walked the trails. I shared the biology of the redwoods, and my eyes were opened by the awareness that its value was what William Kent called a primeval forest, or what we now call an old-growth forest. And then my career expanded to understanding that the landscape was really important, the Redwood Creek watershed, and that one of the higher callings was stewarding it, restoring it to health. And now today, that it also offers some of the most important lessons for climate change. But I've always been humbled working there, and never more so in 2021, when the young rangers at Muir Woods took a deep breath and posed that we really had been leaving out most of the history. That the facts we were saying, they didn't question, but the story was incomplete. And by offering an incomplete story, we were missing the bigger context. We were leaving out a lot of people who had made significant contributions. we had ignored that in reality, most of the timeline of Muir Woods was the Coast Miwok stewardship, that it was actually, and I know this isn't a surprise to most of this audience, but it was really a lot of great women behind those amazing men who made a huge difference. And so the rangers at Muir Woods started really sharing in New York Times style a whole new way of sharing the history of Muir Woods. And they called it Muir Woods History Under Construction, because they acknowledged that we all tell our favorite stories, we all have our life history, we all have our perspective, we all are shaped by how we grew up. But that didn't mean that the story we told was really necessarily complete or helped us understand everything. And they told this story, and you can go to Muir Woods today and see the Wayside exhibit in which they have doctored through Post-its the timeline and the story to offer a more complete view. And the effectiveness of this is they understood that the story that Fred and I have told often, and in 2017 at West Point Inn, it's all there, but there's a lot more to it. And so it effectively shows how we pick and choose. And so I'm very honored tonight and humbled to have been invited by Fred to share the story and jump in and offer some of the pieces that Muir Woods now offers to complete the story and how they got there. And they even loaned me some of the handouts that I took notes from once upon a time. That's my writing up there. So I thought I'd bring myself in that way. And so we're doing something really exciting tonight. We enjoyed talking, and there's many of you who've really helped us understand and go deeper and helped us with the research. So we're going to talk, and every so often I'm going to nudge Fred and step in, and maybe you raise your hand and say, what about that? And we're just going to have kind of a creative adventure as we share. And I got to tell you, the most rewarding thing working with Fred is he really, and others in this room, they get the complexities of the story. Because after all, you know, none of us are perfect. We've all learned from each other. We've all gone further on our life road and contributions. And that's what I really appreciate about you, Fred. And you also want to tell the story with the real thing, like number 9. That's what we do in the Park Service, is we tell the story with the real trees. And so come there and listen to it from me there. But I just really appreciate your perspective on history. So thanks for this invitation.
Thank you, Mia. And right back at you, because Mia has spent, I don't know how many decades at Muir Woods?
40 plus.
Okay, yeah. But who's counting, right?
Yeah.
A friend of mine named Bill Provines, who was the last living crewman who worked on the Mount Tamalpais Railway, once said to me, I've seen the mountain in all its moods. Mia has done the same thing at Muir Woods. That's a treasure that, you know, few people can actually hold on to. Most people just, you know, pass through, spend a few minutes there or an hour or two there maybe, but Mia has seen all of it. So we are lucky to have Mia here tonight.
Thank you, Fred. Do you have any number 9 news for us?
Yeah, well, I can certainly talk about how the restoration's been going. It's been really moving along nicely. We have pulled the whole locomotive apart. We've sent it off to be cleaned and sandblasted. It's been painted. We're in the process of reassembling it. We've put the frame back on the wheels. We're right now working on the boiler, which is the heart of the engine. And that's been cleaned, sandblasted, and painted. And we're right now working on the sheet metal jacketing that goes on the outside. That's where the words, some of the words like 9 will be on the outside of the locomotive. The tender's done. That's at the back end. That's going to get the big words. That's going to say Mount Tamalpais and Muir Woods in gold letters with a red drop shadow. That's important. Anyway, so right now, number 9 is being worked on. As many of you probably know, we don't have a location at the moment, and that's okay, because we've had several offers for places that all look very interesting, and we're not ready to talk about any of them until we've actually had a chance to dig into them and vet them. So that'll be a process, and we'll be sure to announce it when we actually have the answer. We're also lucky enough to have Joe Breeze here tonight, and Joe has spent, among many parts of the number 9 project, hundreds of hours of designing what's called a pilot which is also known as a cow catcher. It's the little pointy thing that goes on the front of the engine that sits just above the rails, and the idea is that if there's a cow sleeping on the track, then it'll move the cow off to the side. Anyway, there weren't any plans for how to build that. Joe went out and measured every little nut and bolt and micron of number 9, and then went over to Rio Vista and looked at a locomotive there. And amazingly, the geometry is fairly similar out at this Western Pacific engine number 94. And then from that, he went back and spent a bunch of time extrapolating the proper blueprint for creating the pilot, which is expected to weigh around 300 pounds. It has 300 parts in it, which are wood and steel. Some pieces are 3/8 inch steel, some are even heavier. And the point is, one of the interesting points in the discussion of that is that part of it's wood so it can actually be broken. So if you hit something hard like a boulder, if you're up on Mount Tam and a boulder came down and landed in the middle of the tracks, the cow catcher or pilot would tend to push it out of the way. But if it couldn't do that, then it would break and not derail the engine, because derailing the engine is a long, slow process to put it back on the track. So that might be more number 9 news than you want to hear, but that's where we're at. There's a bunch of pictures on the website, friendsofno9.org. Please feel free to take a look and let us know what you think. So that's the number 9 news.
And I just want to add that the salmon are spawning in Muir Woods. And it's been 120 years since a bear took up residence, but it did this summer and stayed and ate a lot of who knows what. And so, yeah, so it's exciting out at the woods in the winter.
Excellent. So, all right, so I'll get going on the story now. Unless you have one more thing you want to add or anything? You good?
We'll circle around at the end because I have some things to share about how moving reviewing the legacy of the Kent family has been. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so let's start in 1905 because it seems like a good place to start. Down in the middle of a place called Redwood Canyon, 2 men who are outdoorsmen, and in fact, seen in this photograph here, are walking around through Redwood Canyon. The 2 men are Sidney Cushing and his friend William Kent. And as they walk through Redwood Canyon, they come across a surveyor that they know because he helped them actually do the initial survey for the railroad grade up Mount Tamalpais. And they say, "John, what are you doing?" "Well, I'm down here for the water company, and we're surveying the canyon. We're going to log out part of the canyon and then build a dam so that Mill Valley has year-round water." And the 2 guys who've been trying for years actually to try to turn the canyon into a park look at each other and realize that their dream is about to go away if they don't go home and do something right away. So that night, William Kent goes home, talks to his wife Elizabeth, and says, "This is what we found today, and if we don't do something right now, the canyon's going to get logged out." And she says, "But, should we have a lot of debt? Should we really risk bankruptcy to do this?" And he says, "I think we should, because if we don't, if we went bankrupt and saved those trees, it would be worth it, wouldn't it?" And she must have said yes, because then they bought it. Kent sent Sidney Cushing, his business partner of many years, out to the bank to see about getting a loan to buy the canyon at the best possible price. Cushing was able to negotiate buying 600 acres for $45,000. Which roughly translates to about $1 million in today's money. So imagine buying 600 acres of virgin redwood in Marin County for $1 million. That's a pretty good deal, any way you slice it. So suddenly they signed the deed, and they own 600 acres of wonderful redwood forest in the middle of Marin County. Their effort actually started years before that. Phil Rhodes would tell you that Laura Lyon White was one of the people that was pushing for saving the canyon. Another one would be, of course, Alice Eastwood, who was the famed botanist who hiked on the mountain, was known for hiking 20 miles a day, wearing a dress and what looked like street shoes, but whatever works, okay. Anyway, Alice Eastwood and Laura Lyon White had actually tried the year before to find a way to raise enough money with society connections to buy the canyon. But that fell apart for reasons that aren't clear to me, so I can't tell you what they are. Anyway, the next year, as I mentioned, Kent and Cushing are walking through the canyon, and they find that they're about to lose the canyon, so they buy it. So suddenly they own the canyon. Philly, if you have a point, please feel free to jump in.
And who do we think might have put the bug in Lovell White's ear? Laura Lyon White, that's right.
One of those women.
And Laura herself wrote the first possible record of a hike into Muir Woods in, 1897? Anyway, she wrote a... Right. She and a group of friends hiked into Redwood Canyon, and she wrote a beautiful essay about the beauties of the forest, the primeval trees, and also the blooming rhododendrons on the forest floor. And I think it was you, Fred, that pointed out to me that she also kind of kicked off the other real important point that this should be accessible to everybody, because she had someone kind of chase her out who thought she might be trespassing, and she dropped a few important names and was able to continue. But she kind of said, I think this should be open to everybody. And she went on to found the California Club, a women's group.
And the Outdoor Art Club.
And the Outdoor Club, right. And this was how a lot of women were very active in the conservation issues of the time. And so she was very, very active already in saving Calaveras Big Trees State Park. So she was in the thick of the conservation movement. But another real interesting thing about that, well, is this a... So she wrote very eloquently. She was part of these early conservation movements. She influenced her husband. And we'll just pick up the thread about Laura later then. Yeah.
Sure, okay. I just did, while we're throwing out early dates and stuff like that, Phil showed me a few years back a story that was written in 1901 that was a full-page story in the San Francisco Call. There were an interviewer, probably Laura Lyon White, talks to Sidney Cushing, the president of the Scenic Railroad, this man here, and William Kent. They're both in Redwood Canyon, and they're wondering in 1901 if there's any way to save the canyon or make it into a park that the public can enjoy. And they're trying to see if the government would be interested in doing such a thing, and there is no interest in the government whatsoever. If you want to cut down trees, great. You want to make a dam, great. You want to save trees? That's stupid. Who would do that? So anyway, in 1901, they're talking about how the Redwood Canyon is the last stand of virgin redwoods near a major city anywhere in the world. And that's not the exact wording that they use, but that's the gist of it. 1901, it's the last stand. I think that's pretty impressive.
Right, and William Kent notes the proximity to the city. So he was already making these connections of not only the last one, but how important it was being close to the city. You know, maybe if we're going to move ahead, I'll just go on about what the Kents were doing back in Chicago. And William Kent was born in Chicago, and he came as a young man as a boy to California and led the outdoor life, riding his horse to school, enjoying the wilds of Marin. And he went to school back at Yale and stayed in the Thatcher home and met who later became his wife, Elizabeth. And they moved to Chicago, where the family still had the meatpacking business. And the only reason I bring this up now is because one of the things that Fred and I talked about is often we bring this story to the Kents, but there were a lot of people that were influential that talked and helped out. We've just pointed out the important role of Laura to Lovell to Kent, but also back in Chicago, a very important friend was Jane Addams. And we know her as someone who was really cleaning up a lot of the problems in Chicago. And they were close friends with Jane Addams. So William and Elizabeth Kent knew Jane Addams well, and Jane Addams was not afraid to say to the Kents, you own one of the worst tenements in Chicago. And it's not good enough to just sell it. You need to help those people. And they did. And then she also turned around and she told them about the conditions of the children of Chicago. And the Kents funded the first playground because they felt kids needed to have a place to play, to get outdoors, and they kind of started, or are credited with starting the playground movement for kids. So this is someone who was shaping their social views, their views of doing good and public service. So that
And also appreciating some open space in an area that was completely built up.
Exactly.
So that's the beginning of kind of getting a bigger idea. Yeah.
So what you just said there and your term close to bankruptcy. So
Yeah. So the Kents had bought the Kents and William Kent and Sidney Cushing had done some real estate speculation down on the shoreline from Stinson Beach around to Seadrift, and they were working on trying to develop the land down there. They bought 2,000 acres of land. The northeast corner of it was where the Mountain Theater is today. And then the other end of that rectangle was down just south of Stinson Beach. And that piece of land wrapped over that corner of Mount Tamalpais and down near to where Muir Woods is today, but not quite that far. Phil and I were talking about this the other day. Catch me if I've misinterpreted some part of this.
I would just add to it that
Okay.
And that was really insightful to me, Phil, you bringing up that first purchase, and then also what put them in a position to not be able to afford another opportunity. Because one of the feelings that I have about their long legacy is just how much public land has been saved for a long time. It's the basis of what we now call one TAM. So to me, I kind of see one of the important legacies of the Kent holdings becoming public land on such a huge, extensive landscape level. So I just see that as an important legacy. And
Yeah.
thanks, Phil, for kind of filling in that early piece.
Yeah, yeah.
tell me if you don't want me to shut up.
Oh, no, 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 no. This is what's been so exciting is,
Yeah.
as I told you, part of this history under construction, part of it is learning new information. Part of it is seeing how the pieces fit together.
A bigger picture.
In the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Part of it is realizing other people were busy, not just the main characters, or the main character Kent. It's Kent's. And so it's been really helpful having Phil to fill this in.
And also, and this another phrase comes to mind: standing on the shoulders of giants. People aren't usually, a monolith unto themselves. They usually have help from other people, and that's part of what this story is about. So, yes, sir. That was owned by the Tamalpais Land and Water Company, and they also owned the 2,000 acres that he bought in 1901. So they had picked up the land from Throckmorton, the Throckmorton estate, and because it was sold to them in bankruptcy. So then they started. They owned a lot of land. Part of that was what the Mountain Railroad was on. There was an easement for the Mountain Railroad, and the rest of it was potential water property, or maybe even we could build some houses. Maybe. So anyway, yes, Phil.
Well, you mentioned Throckmorton.
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry.
I didn't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but yeah, okay.
But Throckmorton, not many people know he was one builder in the mountain.
Okay. And Phil has been remarkable at digging up things that none of us would ever have imagined. So thank you for digging deeply.
So Fred, you wrote here in that 1901 effort, Kent says, there is no other wilderness so picturesque and so easily accessible to a great city, when he was calling for Tam National Park.
Yep. So did you have a quick question?
Yeah, just a quick question.
Yeah. Friends. They knew each other. I wouldn't say they played pool together, but they knew each other socially. And as I mentioned, there was a group of women headed by Alice Eastwood the year before that had tried to buy the same land, and I don't know why that effort fell apart, but it did. So they were desperate to try to find a way to. They really wanted to see it not get logged out. So Kent and Cushing together, when they discovered that the surveying was underway and it was about to be lost, that they shifted into high gear and were able to. Well, the water company, yes, exactly. So Cushing went in and negotiated the deal for 600 acres for $45,000, roughly $1 million in today's money, And on August 31st, 1905, the Kents owned 600 acres of Redwood Canyon. So that's how that worked.
Phil, did you have something else to?
Yeah, your rangers found out something very.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. So I'm going to jump back into 1905 here. So August 31st, the Kents now own 600 acres of Redwood Canyon. Things kind of shift into high gear at that point because the Kents now own a place that they can turn into a park. And how do you do that? How do you deal with getting people there? How do you deal with rules? What are the rules? How do you deal with bathrooms? How do you deal with, litter? All the stuff of creating a park. Anyway, on November 18th, by November 18th, William Kent has figured out how he wants to name the canyon. Another one of Phil's great searches turned up a letter from William Kent's lawyer, William Thomas, to John Muir saying, Mr. Kent and his business partner, Sidney Cushing, have bought Redwood Canyon, and they'd like to put your name on it. Would you be willing to give your name to this? These are two men of quality and of character. I've known them for over 20 years, and I hope you will. And he does this in part because he's actually met Muir before and spent some time with him at the University Club. We don't have Muir's response, but clearly it was yes, because sometime later it becomes Muir Woods. So
Don't forget the Alice Eastwood toast.
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually 10 days after the letter from William Thomas goes to John Muir. That's on August 28th. There's a memo from Sidney Cushing to Alice Eastwood, and the memo is it's a pass for Alice Eastwood to go enjoy Thanksgiving down in Redwood Canyon with her friends. And Cushing says in the note, he says, if you got anything stronger than water, you may want to toast the new name of Redwood Canyon. Mr. Kent has just figured out that he wants to call it Muir Woods. So that's a nice little landmark there too. And just in time for the Thanksgiving weekend. So that's 1905, a big year. 1906, not too much happens except an earthquake. So what happens is Kent and Cushing are, again, are outdoorsmen that I haven't talked too much about this, but Kent and Cushing are outdoorsmen who like to hike. Kent has learned to ride a horse in Marin County. He's learned to be an excellent marksman. They both spend a lot of time hiking and enjoying Mount Tamalpais, which is, of course, what many of us do. Now that they own the canyon, they want to figure out how are we going to get people here. And part of the discussion is putting a railroad into the canyon because that's the best way to move a lot of people. So that's part of the discussion. Then is they're on an outing in the middle of April of 1906. They find a spot that they think is going to be a good spot to put an inn in Muir Woods, something like the inn that they've got up on top of Mount Tam, which is a way to draw people up to the mountain, enjoy a meal and see the view and enjoy yourself. They want to have a destination. So there's a destination they want to have for Muir Woods too. And so they find a place that they think is going to be a good spot to build the inn. It'll be the end of the tracks for the railroad. They put out their bedrolls, go to sleep, and in the middle of the night, shortly after 5 a.m., they're shaken out of their bedrolls by the 1906 earthquake. And the reason we know this is because William Kent was writing letters to his wife, Elizabeth. Those letters are in the Yale archive where Kent went to college. So Tim Wood, who's another one of the contributors to all the information that we know here, discovered those in the Kent archive. And so that was an interesting little sidebar. They realized as they climbed out of the canyon that day with seeing the smoke coming up from San Francisco that their dream of putting a railroad into Redwood Canyon was going to be delayed for a little while. So the good news is that by the late 1906, they've actually surveyed and are ready to start laying track. And that happens at the end of 1906. By the spring of 1907, the first train is actually heading into Redwood Canyon. A guy named Roy Graves, who was one of the young employees on the Mountain Railroad, and also a mentor for a historian who wrote the first book about the railroad on Mount Tamalpais. That author was Ted Worm. Roy Graves worked as a fireman for a few months in 1907, before they found out that he was 17 years old, and they fired him for being too young. But he was the fireman on the first train into Redwood Canyon, and it was a trainload full of school kids coming to find out what virgin redwoods were all about. So Kent's dream was being realized, and that's half the fun of that story. So then later in 1907, Kent has the flu, and because he can, they decide to go to Hawaii while he dries out from the flu. And when he comes back in December, he understands that there's a lawsuit now brewing in the Marin County courts. It's a eminent domain lawsuit to take away the part of the canyon from the Kents. And they're flummoxed that this is happening. So Kent, luckily, has a friend in Washington, D.C. named Gifford Pinchot, who runs the Forest Service. Both of them are Yale graduates. Both of them were in a fraternity known as Skull and Bones. So they kind of had some connections. And Kent reaches out to Pinchot because he knows that the canyon is now threatened. The water company, again, wants to dam the canyon and log part of it out. So he gets in touch with Pinchot and he says, I want to give 300 acres on the floor of the canyon to the federal government to protect it from being logged out. And Pinchot, and I'd like to give it to the Forest Service. I'm paraphrasing a lot of the stuff in here. I hope that's okay with everybody. The gist is that Pinchot says, you don't want to give it to the Forest Service. If you give it to the Forest Service, it's a managed asset. We could log it out. What you want to do is you want to give it to the Department of the Interior. The president has been doing good things with the new Antiquities Act. You may have heard about that. Let me talk to the president. Amazingly, Roosevelt and Pinchot were two close friends. So he says, let me talk to the president and see what we can figure out. This is in the month of December. So on December 31st, by December 31st, they figured out what they're going to do. The Kents deed 300 acres on the floor of the canyon to the federal government. The deed itself was signed in San Rafael at the Civic Center, at City Hall, actually. No, Civic Center. And it's signed by William and Elizabeth Kent. The first witness is Sidney Cushing, Kent's close friend and business partner. The second one is William Thomas, who's again Kent's lawyer and the guy who's managed all the legal aspects of this, effort in a very short amount of time. So that gets sent to Washington, and then in January, Kent receives a letter from Teddy Roosevelt that advises Kent that you may have seen my proclamation from January 9th declaring Redwood Canyon a national monument, but you want to call it Muir Woods. You're paying for it. Why don't we call this Kent Woods? And Kent writes back and says, well, thank you for the honor. I'm glad you like what we've done, but I don't want to cheapen the benefaction by making it seem like I'm trying to buy immortality. John Muir's done good things. He showed us that wilderness has value. He deserves the honor, and I'm fine with that. I have 5 sons and a daughter, and if our family name is going to mean something, then they'll make it mean something. And if they don't, then we should be forgotten like hundreds of other people who've done good things and are forgotten. And Roosevelt writes back and basically says, bully, good for you. He says, we'll call it Muir Woods, and it's done. And shortly after that, John Muir finds out that the canyon now has his name on it. He writes William Kent a thank you note. In it, he says, this is the best tree lovers monument that could possibly be found in all the forests of the world. You've done me a great honor, and I'm proud of it. People don't write letters like that anymore.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning of 1908.
What did they do with the extra 600 acres? The extra 300 acres?
Oh, you're jumping ahead of the story there. But I do want to just step in for a moment after that very moving story of generosity and good advice, because another bit of information that the Muir Woods Rangers have turned up is that those Yaleys also were strong proponents of eugenics, and also kind of felt like there was a master race, and they were already getting concerned about the immigrants that were moving into California. And so these people had many good causes, but there isn't really any evidence that the Kents were involved in eugenics, but Gifford Pinchot was a leader in this movement. And Kent, which is a little ahead of the story, was very active in the anti-Asian movements of the turn of the last century. So this is really concerning, but it's also kind of sobering. One reason I talked about the Jane Addams story is that they had friends from all different kinds of causes who influenced them in many, many ways, and we'll get to some more of them later. But this is the other kind of social thing that was brewing at that time. One thing that kind of came up, though I've never really heard this myself because it wasn't in the Muir Woods literature, but those people who were busy saving redwoods up and down the coast would actually use redwoods as examples of the superior race. So they were linking that concept. And whether that came into Muir Woods or Marin is uncertain, but the effort to save redwoods was going up the coast. So anyway, there was a lot of other social stuff going on at the same time.
Yep. So two things that I forgot to mention. One of them is as the whole dialogue between Kent and Pinchot is going on, and they're trying to figure out, about saving the canyon and what are they going to do and where they're going to direct the deed and that kind of thing. The Secretary of the Interior, my brain isn't working. It just suddenly
The
went
one that
blank.
starts with B,
It does start with
Bollinger.
No, Bollinger is that would be in Taft's administration.
Okay, Secretary
G.
of
It
Interior.
starts with G, and I'm forgetting. Anyway, he didn't want to touch the deed at all
That's great, yeah.
because it was under, it was brewing in the courts and it had legal issues around it. He didn't want to have anything to do with Redwood Canyon. Teddy Roosevelt said, "Too bad, we're doing it," and so Roosevelt then signed the deed and took the land. This is 2 months before his term has expired. The week after Muir Woods is created, Grand Canyon becomes a national monument. So there was some big stuff going on. Yes, Phil?
Was it Garfield?
Yes, thank you. G for Garfield, yes, thank you.
It was Alice Eastwood that introduced.
And one of the other things that I left out is that as Kent is considering, turning Redwood Canyon into a park, one of the considerations along the way is maybe we should turn this into a biological preserve for UC Berkeley so that the students can come over here and study this ecosystem. I don't know how long that idea lasts, but it obviously wasn't the final decision with Redwood Canyon.
But it did echo into the proclamation. Something that is very timely is how often the Antiquities Act comes up as an important tool. We have Biden bringing the Antiquities Act in to save significant Southwest lands. We had Obama creating many lands because it's the ability of the president to set aside land. That's what is the Antiquities Act, is the ability to move quickly and set aside land without having to go through Congress. And that's what makes it a national monument. And Teddy Roosevelt had been very busy in 1908 because Muir Woods was the 10th national monument. And the proclamation that talks about the significance of Muir Woods talks about the beautiful antiquity of the trees, the primeval quality, the proximity to an urban area, and the scientific institutions. So Kents were already realizing the multifaceted importance, and they were the first citizens to give land to the federal government and the first place next to an urban area. So they had a lot of vision.
Those are
when
good
they were using
accomplishments.
that. Yeah.
Good accomplishments to be proud of. So yeah,
When does William Kent become a congressman?
1911. 1911. Yeah, March 4, 1911. And I didn't have to look it up. So moving on to 1909, as I mentioned, Roosevelt only had a few months left in office. William Howard Taft becomes the next president, and people expect that he's going to be basically a repeat of Teddy Roosevelt. They all think he's going to be the same kind of guy, and it turns out he's not. So Kent has actually been communicating with the help of Pinchot on some level with William Howard Taft, asking him about conservation and all in many issues around conservation. And Kent is not happy or satisfied on any level with what he's getting back from Taft. So picking this up in 1909, I have this wonderful book that I stumbled onto called California Progressivism, and there's a terrific story in here about William Kent and Lake Tahoe. So in 1909, just as the president was coming under fire, this is Taft, from many of the progressives, Kent discovered that Taft and Bollinger, the Secretary of Interior, had approved a plan to divert water from Lake Tahoe to run a series of privately owned hydroelectric plants to provide water for irrigation for the Truckee-Carson reclamation project, which would have actually turned Carson City in Nevada green for agriculture. Everything about this project alarmed Kent, and the project also called for power plants that were owned by Stone and Webster, an engineering corporation that was one of the largest public utility corporations in the nation. Stone and Webster received the rights to the water flowing from Lake Tahoe in return for guaranteeing the Bureau of Reclamation a certain amount of water each year to reclaim the land in the arid alkaline Carson Valley. In order to provide reliable amounts of water for the reclamation project and produce electricity, the contract allowed the power company to bore a hole through the Sierra Nevada on the eastern side of Lake Tahoe, dropping the level of the lake more than 50 feet if necessary. William Kent did not need to be told that such a contract was dangerous. Not only could the beaches of Lake Tahoe be destroyed, and Kent was a fairly new owner of Lake Tahoe property, but a private company would reap unlimited profits on a public resource, and that was actually one of Kent's fundamental tenets, was that he felt that public lands should be for public benefit and not exploited by private corporations for profit. So he actually rallies a number of property owners in Lake Tahoe, and they actually break the Taft-Bollinger utility deal for Lake Tahoe. Otherwise, Lake Tahoe would be lower than it is today. So that's William Kent in 1909, and that impressed me tremendously when I first read that. So, and then in 1910, just because he doesn't have anything else going on, William Kent runs for Congress, and he wins. So, and then in 1911, on March 4th, he begins the first of 3 terms in Congress. Just after he gets sworn in as a congressman, Elizabeth Kent has a picnic lunch with Edith Roosevelt and a bunch of other ladies in Muir Woods. So that's the friendship with the Roosevelts is continuing. So in 1912, after Kent has been a congressman for almost a year, he comes back to Marin County and begins to campaign for this bond measure to go on the ballot. Referendum to go on the ballot that will create the MMWD. There's a new law on the books in California that you can create a municipal agency that will serve a community of cities or towns. Up to that point, the water companies were private entities for each town. So you could have one water company for Corte Madera and one for Mill Valley and one for Sausalito, but they couldn't work together as a unit. And Kent's people, darn it, another blank in my head. Mott, first name, I forget Mott's first name, but Phil probably knows. Anyway, Mott is Kent's secretary. He is a huge Mount Tamalpais advocate, and he tells Kent about the new law to be able to create municipal water agencies. And so Kent puts a referendum on the ballot and says, I think that we can build a municipal water company here that will work for the benefit of all the communities of Marin County. And if you agree with it, and it will work for the public benefit, not at outrageous prices, and it will be listening to the people of Marin County, and then we can build a nice system that works for everybody. If you agree with this concept, please vote yes on this referendum. It passes by 85%, so we must have done a good job. And that's how the MMWD gets created, and a couple of years later, there's a bond measure on the ballot that will, for $3 million, that will build Alpine Dam and buy the lands that will become the MMWD watershed. And the unwritten part of all of this is that William Kent, as has been mentioned, was trying to turn Mount Tamalpais into a national park to keep it from being developed. And again, the state wasn't interested in all this land with trees and such on it. The federal government wasn't interested in all the land with trees and animals and other things on it. Kent didn't want to see it developed, so the creation of the municipal water district winds up being a way to create a watershed that you can't build on, and as a way for him to preserve Mount Tamalpais in its rustic original wild state. And that's a bit of genius, I think. So that's 1912. So then fast forward to 1915, which is a big year for the Bay Area. 1915 is the year of the Panama Pacific International Exposition, this huge, wonderful fair on the northern waterfront of San Francisco, 2.5 mile long city of palaces and domes and towers. And if you've ever seen a picture of it, you know that this was an amazing construction. Almost 19 million people came from around the world to visit the World's Fair. Over 100,000 of them came up Mount Tamalpais on the train to have a meal at the tavern, to take a gravity car down to Muir Woods and walk around down there and see what that was all about. The railroad did very well that year, thank you very much. That happened during the course of the year. In May, the Mountain Play stages its third Mountain Play. It will be Rip Van Winkle, which is in fact the first play to be rained out. So that's on May 23rd. They get most of the way through the play before this drenching rain comes through and everybody kind of runs. So the next weekend actually is June. At the end of May is I've erased the date. Oh well. May 28th. That's the next weekend. There is a congressional delegation of people that have come to San Francisco to see the World's Fair. Kent brings them across the bay and on the train up to the tavern to show them how a managed wilderness works. They get on gravity cars, they go down into Muir Woods, where he's hosting a big barbecue down there for these congressional delegations. And he tells everybody there that they're trying to make this a national park. What he's really, and I think in part doing is this lobbying for the Organic Act that he will bring to Congress the next year. He's an essential author of the Organic Act that will create the National Park Service. And this is him showing easy access to a wilderness and how you get people into and out of successfully, comfortably into a wilderness.
So you don't think it's maybe feeling a little regret over the Raker Act that dammed the Tuolumne River and created the Hetch Hetchy water system?
That might be part of it.
Okay. Oh, no, yeah.
Big piece of, I've looked up this, before you get too far.
Yeah.
And that is watershed. Tamalpais conservation.
Absolutely. Mount Tamalpais, I'm sorry. Are you done?
No, you know I'm done. No.
Yeah, okay. I was,
It creates a different kind of watershed from Crystal Springs.
yeah.
San Francisco and the others. It becomes really a kind of critical.
I was going to mention, I grew up on the peninsula, and the Crystal Springs watershed down there is completely forbidden. It is private, jealously guarded private land, and yet Marin is not that at all. And it's a good news, bad news thing. So anyway.
Well, we have 1912. Kent helps found TCC, 135 members to support, and was a cornerstone of MMWD.
And they first come together to actually pick up litter on Mount Tamalpais because people are leaving junk around the trails. Mm-hmm. So, and then they grow up into becoming this huge hiking advocacy group, promoting hikes and building trails. And there's a wonderful little booklet that I ran into from the late 1930s where they say, if you want to hike and don't want to hike alone, come to the ferry building. This is an example of all the hiking that was going on between, say, 1910 and the late 30s when it all dissolved finally away. But if you want to hike and don't want to hike alone, come to the ferry building on a Sunday morning between 8 and 8:15. There are volunteer hike leaders will be there. They have color placards. Each color of the placard corresponds with a hike described in this little pamphlet. Queue up with those people and then walk on board the ferry boat Eureka. I'm told the ferry boat Eureka used to had a capacity of 3,300 people, and frequently it was jam-packed. It would set sail from the ferry building and wind up in Sausalito. The hikers would stream off the ferry boat and head onto the trains. One set of trains would take them to Mill Valley. Another one would take them around Mount Tam to San Anselmo, Fairfax. The people that went into Mill Valley would visit the mom and pop stores there, get a salami, chocolate bar, and then take their girlfriend. One person described it this way: up on the trails, and if she was really hardy, they might get as far as West Point. Other hikers that were maybe more seasoned went around to San Anselmo, Fairfax, and they would come over the mountain. Some of them brought cast iron fry pans and built fires and cooked things for lunch. All of them converged on the depot in Mill Valley at the end of the day. My friend Bill Provines mentioned that when the trains got there in the morning and everybody headed from the trains up to the mountain, it sounded like an army was marching up Throckmorton Avenue heading for the Dipsea Steps. In the afternoon, he said people came down to the trains to get on board the trains to head back to Sausalito and then back to the city. And people would see friends they hadn't seen in a long time, so they'd strike up a conversation through an open window on the trains. Some of them would try to wriggle up through the window to sit next to their friend because the vestibules at either end of the cars were jammed. So the trains would then take off, and the trains, I don't know how frequent they were, but something like every half hour. Trains could hold 500 people per train. They would head back to Sausalito. At Sausalito, you'd head onto the ferry. There was drinking on the ferry. There was singing on the ferry. People sang, World War I marching songs like "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" and things like that. So it sounds like a good time to me. They'd get back to San Francisco, and of course, at the ferry building, in those days, there was streetcar service pretty much everywhere in San Francisco, so you could get home pretty quickly. You didn't need a car, and that was the hiking culture for the teens, 20s, and 30s. And it was the bread and butter for a place called the West Point Inn. So anyway, I digress.
Well, maybe while we're still on 1915, was there
Yeah.
something about the mountain play?
Oh, yeah. Well, the mountain play, actually, I'm going to wait for just a minute longer before we do that, if you don't mind.
So we're at the Organic Act then?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, what I'm referring to is part of the Kent legacy because, as I referred to a few moments ago, as congressman, he was one of the advocates for the Raker Act, which was part of the effort to supply good drinking water to San Francisco. And the problem with this is that it meant building a dam in a national park, Yosemite, and then bringing the water to Crystal Springs Reservoir. And this, of course, was fought tooth and nail by John Muir and the desecration of a temple of nature. And it put Kent and Muir, who'd been good friends, at bitter odds. But it was also part of Kent's values of public drinking water and the public good of having publicly owned drinking water. So that happened. And the other possible reason I was posing for the Organic Act of 1916, which established the National Park Service, was some say that Kent kind of had some sleepless nights wondering what he had just done to Yosemite and wondering if that was the right solution. And he sought a way to possibly do better. And he continued as a group of congressmen to bring the Organic Act to the floor. And it was kind of hard to get people. It was summer, et cetera. And you told me a really good story about how they finally got the vote, if you don't mind sharing that.
Just backtrack just a little bit. Kent was the essential co-author in the House of Representatives for the Organic Act. His friend Reed Smoot from Utah was the sponsor for the Organic Act in the Senate. So the two of them carried this into a very busy legislative season in the summer of 1916. There was a contentious vote. The main congressman, I forgot the guy's name, who was their main opponent for the Organic Act, they had set up a diversionary golf match for him. And when they counted the votes that they had, they realized that they didn't need the diversionary golf match, so that was canceled. And the Organic Act did win, and Woodrow Wilson signed it into law on August 25th, 1916. And that creates, for the first time ever, the national... What's that?
Just was going to recite it, just in case anyone wanted to know
Yeah,
if
no,
my
it's
blood was still green
very
or not.
eloquent.
Yeah.
Creates for the first time ever the National Park Service. Take it away, Mia.
Well, just to preserve and protect unimpaired for future generations, provide for education and recreation, do this in partnership. And what I like about it is it doesn't say what kind of future generations. It's not necessarily people. It could be owls or fish. Anyway, very high-minded, very, very challenging mission to try to implement. And so it's just really a beautiful piece of legislation. And if you go to Sequoia National Park, there's the telegram from Kent to Stephen Mather. The deed is done. I don't mean to bring modern politics into this, but having you just told me that story about the golf match. Yeah. Did any of you read what NATO just did to get the vote for Scandinavia? No. They sent Orban out to lunch. Anyway, it's a true story. Anyway, so that strategy is
still useful.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Anyway, so William Kent was a champion of the Organic Act and the national park. And of course, all of this rang true because Stephen Mather had campaigned for national parks all around the nation, and the way to get people there, which was often through railroads and lodges. And so Kent was already ahead of that game. So,
yeah, and it's walking in William Kent or Sidney Cushing's footsteps. It's kind of it's very easy to do that around here. You can walk the trails in Muir Woods. You can go up to the West Point Inn because the West Point Inn was built when Cushing and Kent were speculating on the land down between Stinson Beach and Seadrift. So if you walk through there, you'll know that you were walking in their footsteps.
Now, Elizabeth was quite busy at this time, too. And so Elizabeth Kent was quite busy as a suffragette, and she was one of the leaders of the movement to bring the vote to women. And, well, you want to tell that story? It's a great one. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So when Kent goes back to be a member of Congress, Elizabeth comes with him, of course. And she hooks up with a group of suffragettes who get arrested pretty regularly for being rowdy and that kind of thing. Anyway, they all get arrested and taken down to the jail.
They chained themselves to the White House fence.
I didn't know that. Okay, thank you for that important point. Anyway, they're all arrested. They're taken down to the local jail, and William Kent comes that night to pay bail and spring his wife, and she says, "No, I'm staying here with my friends." And the jail in those days were putrid places. You didn't want to be there, but she wasn't going to leave her friends. So that's a great Elizabeth
And what
Kent
did
story.
he do? He bailed them all out.
That I didn't know.
Yes.
Okay.
So he bailed them all out, and in one of their letters, someone asked him what he thought of Elizabeth's activities. And he very eloquently states that that's her business. He respects the thinking of his wife. He doesn't necessarily have to agree with all the causes, but this one he does.
Yeah, it's a good partnership for sure. So Kent and Cushing are good friends. We've talked about that a bunch. Sadly, Sidney Cushing commits suicide in 1909. Cushing has had a stroke and becomes partially paralyzed and apparently depressed too, and he feels that the best solution for him is to commit suicide. He says in his suicide note that it's the greatest favor that he can do his family is to not be a burden on them as his health declines. So 6 years later, when William Kent has got those several weeks up on the mountain, where he's got the congressional delegation and watching the mountain play. At the end of the repeat mountain play, the makeup performance on June 6th, Kent takes the podium and says that he's there to give the land of the Mountain Theater to the fledgling Mountain Play organization. This is their third mountain play, and he says that his deal is that he wants to have it be memorialized for his friend Sidney Cushing. And as I mentioned, this is 6 years after Cushing died. And of course, if they weren't really good friends, Kent would have forgotten about Cushing. He could have named it for his wife. He could have named it for Gifford Pinchot, could have named it for anybody, but he chooses to honor his friend Sidney Cushing. And to me, that's a really great example of how good their friendship was and their partnership in friendship and in business. So that's a lovely little personal note, I think. Yeah, Hillary. I don't know when that happened. I know that Sidney Cushing gave Alice Eastwood a lifetime pass on the Mountain Railroad. Yeah, she was an avid hiker, so but I think it's a wonderfully indicative of his generosity to know that he gave her a lifetime pass to ride the railroad. So no, I don't know at what point she
think
named
it
one
was
of the
before.
manzanitas for the Cushing family. Do you know?
I think it was
But before, okay, before committing, okay, okay. So anyway, fast forwarding to 1945. As we understand it, it's actually Laura Lyon White that is responsible for that. As you probably all know, Susan B. Anthony was the first celebrity to ride the Mountain Railroad. The railroad wasn't even a month old when she rode with two women's groups from Mill Valley to the top of the mountain. And at the top of the mountain, we have a newspaper story that tells us that she and several women read speeches. Apparently, along the way, the men that were constructing the new tavern, it wasn't finished yet, applauded at several key points during the speech. And then all of them got on the train and they all went back down the mountain as the sun was setting into the Pacific Ocean. And that's the Susan B. Anthony story. She was campaigning for women to get the right to vote. This is in 1896. Women did not get the right to vote that year because conservative San Francisco voted it down. It passed in every other region of California, apparently, but not in San Francisco.
I was also thinking when you were talking about the mountain play and the beautiful mountain theater of the important period of the 1930s that brought the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA to Marin to really transform our landscape in so many ways, including the beautiful gem of the mountain theater. And the Seas also brought Elizabeth Kent and Eleanor Roosevelt together quite a bit, and Francis Perkins and others who were campaigning for the bigger social causes and aspects of the Seas at that time.
Excellent. A lot of important, famous people. One of them that's worth mentioning for sure is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who apparently did visit Mount Tamalpais. There are apparently pictures of him hobnobbing in 1915, about the time that Kent invited the congressional delegations over to Muir Woods. He was the Secretary of the Navy at that point. But in 1945, as we all know, World War II was underway and ended with a project that was very important to the world. Mia, would you?
So the world was still at war, but Roosevelt was seeking a different solution to resolve the problems of the world, and he was meeting with other world leaders to bring everyone together to discuss what would become the United Nations. And he was talking to his cabinet about how the United States could host this, and it was suggested that San Francisco be the site because the Pacific Theater was still active. And his Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, said to Roosevelt, "You are a lover of nature and trees. Just north of San Francisco is a beautiful grove of redwoods. And when you walk there, you feel peace. And no matter what language you speak, the language of nature is universal. How about if we bring the delegates, when they arrive in San Francisco, to Muir Woods and have that natural dedication to the bigger causes?" That isn't what happened. Roosevelt suddenly died. The delegates still met in San Francisco. It was one of the rainiest winters or springs, and they finally came in May to Muir Woods, all 500 of them coming to Muir Woods, walking the half mile to what we now know as Cathedral Grove, listening to high-minded speeches, which brought the higher virtues and qualities of peace that Roosevelt had espoused. And it's really moving who was there and what they said and what they dedicated themselves to. And then they rolled up their sleeves and went back to work in San Francisco. And it also, the Park Service thinks, helped connect national parks to higher values and places where people can come together and think things. And of course, it brought the concept of national parks to an international audience. So it was a very, very moving thing. I do feel compelled to tell you that I was there 50 years later when the United Nations again met in Muir Woods, hosted by the Kent and Roosevelt families. Maybe some of you were there. And at that time, Lanny Pinola, a Pomo, was the one who greeted them, And it was the first time that an Indigenous person greeted the peoples of the world and led them to Cathedral Grove. And so it was kind of the park's commitment to make sure that part of our heritage was recognized. So to me, it just seems like many people still walk to Cathedral Grove and feel those same universal concepts. We now know that Cathedral Grove has another reason because, as we mentioned earlier, the Kents recognized Muir Woods as a primeval forest, and that is what we've used to protect the airspace and the quiet on the trails and guide the visitation levels at Muir Woods. Is the natural soundscape is very, very important in a redwood forest, and today our whole reservation system supports a level of visitation that keeps things quiet. We protect the soundscape through 6 months in which we don't do anything noisy to protect spotted owls, but also keep the quiet down. We are now the only no-fly zone over a national park. So the natural soundscape, and part of it is because of the peace and quiet of Cathedral Grove, as well as wanting to protect the primeval quality of the forest. So these things have, in my theme of legacy, you don't really know all the different ways things are going to ripple down through the decades. Yeah. And today I just really am always inspired by the legacy of the Kents and their public service, their committing of their personal fortune to so much of the public lands. One of the last things, if you don't mind reading this, no. Fred, Kents gave more land to the state parks during his life, Steep Ravine the day before he died, another primeval forest. And of course, we have those landscapes protected collaboratively through One TAM now, and the stewardship continues. We just undid some of that CCC work in Muir Woods by removing a lot of the revetment in the creek to restore the nursery habitat for the baby fish. So it's just really, even though Kent was not a perfect person, today we now are reminded that some of his practices, anti-Asian, for example, we need to renew our commitment to make sure everybody is welcome. And having someone who felt differently kind of renews your commitment to these important things. So thank you for letting us reminisce about the important legacy and their friends and how it takes a team. I'm sure we have many corners to go. Thank you, Phil, for contributing so much, the library for hosting us. It's been really rewarding working with you, Fred.
Right back at you, Mia. Thank you very much.